It's a Tuesday evening. Margaret Chen is standing in her kitchen, filling up a little ceramic bowl with premium salmon-flavored cat food, the expensive kind, the one with the tiny fish printed on the label. She sets it down on the mat by the back door, glances at the clock, and smiles. Right on time. Seconds later, she hears the familiar sound, a soft, deliberate thud on the porch steps, then the slow creak of the cat flap she installed last spring. And then he appears, a large, magnificently fluffy orange tabby with white paws and the most self-satisfied expression you've ever seen on a living creature. He saunters in like a king returning to his palace, sniffs the bowl once, as if confirming it meets his standards, and begins to eat. Margaret watches him with pure, uncomplicated love. "There you are, Marmalade," she whispers. She's had Marmalade for 3 years. Well, she thinks she's had him for 3 years. She found him wandering near her garden one spring. Afternoon, skinny and a little scraggly, and she took him in. She got him vaccinated, neutered, microchipped. She bought him a heated bed, 2 scratching posts, and a selection of toys he largely ignores in favor of sitting on her laptop. She is, by any reasonable definition, his owner. She has no idea what happens to him between 8 a.m. and 6 p.m. every day. Now let's walk 40 feet to the left, through the shared fence, past the rose bushes that have been the subject of a very polite but very tense, ongoing disagreement, and into the backyard of the house next door. There's a wooden deck, string lights, a little bistro table where a man named David Park likes to drink his morning coffee and read the news on his tablet. And there, on the deck railing, sitting in a patch of late afternoon sun, as though personally placed there by a Renaissance painter, is a large, magnificently fluffy orange tabby with white paws and an expression that suggests he owns the property. David comes out with a bowl. Premium tuna flavor, different brand from Margaret's, but similarly expensive. The cat drops from the railing, loops around David's ankles once in a figure 8, and settles in front of the bowl. "Good evening, Captain," David says. Captain Fluffington, or Captain Fluff, or just Captain, depending on David's mood, has lived with David for almost 2.5 years. David's girlfriend found him on the street and suggested they take him in temporarily. Temporarily became permanently, as it usually does with cats. David got him neutered, or so he believed, microchipped, vet-checked. He bought a special orthopedic cat bed, which the cat uses about 15% of the time. The rest of the time, the cat sleeps on David's face, his pillow, or the exact center of the couch. He is also, by any reasonable definition, the cat's owner. Neither Margaret nor David has ever had a full conversation with each other. They've waved over the fence. They've nodded in the driveway. Once, during a particularly heavy rainstorm, Margaret shouted, "Terrible weather!" and David shouted back, "Awful!" And they both went inside. That was the longest exchange they'd had in 3 years of living 30 feet apart. They did not know they were both feeding the same cat. The cat, who had apparently decided at some point that 1 loving home was fine, but 2 loving homes was simply better logistics, had been running this operation for somewhere between 2 and 3 years. He was not a stray. He was not neglected. He was, in fact, one of the most well-fed, well-loved, and comprehensively pampered cats in the entire neighborhood. He simply had 2 residences, 2 names, 2 sets of food bowls, 2 heated beds, and 2 humans who believed with complete sincerity that they were the primary person in his life. He played both roles flawlessly. At Margaret's house, he was an indoor-outdoor cat who came home for dinner and sometimes spent the night curled at the foot of her bed. He had a favorite window seat there, and he knew that if he sat next to Margaret while she was reading, she would eventually put the book down and scratch behind his ears for an unreasonable amount of time. At David's house, he was an outdoor cat who let himself onto the deck and occasionally deigned to come inside. He knew that David got up earlier, so breakfast was more reliably available there. He knew that David's couch had a specific warm spot near the left armrest that was ideal for a 3 p.m. nap. He knew that David would forget to close the bedroom door at night, which meant access to the good pillow. He had optimized his entire existence. This is the story of how it all came apart, and how it somehow, improbably, made everything better. But before we get to the unraveling, we should spend some time with both of these people, because this story isn't really about a cat running a scam. It's about two neighbors who were lonely in quiet ways they hadn't fully admitted to. Themselves, connected by a fluffy orange bridge they didn't know they were sharing. Margaret Chen was 63 years old and had lived alone in that house for 7 years since her divorce. Her children, she had two, a son in Seattle and a daughter in London, called regularly and visited occasionally, and she loved them and missed them in the particular way that parents miss adult children who have built full lives of their own. She had friends, a book club, a part-time consulting job she did from her kitchen table. She was not unhappy, but the house had a quality of silence that she'd never fully made peace with, and Marmalade, whoever Marmalade actually was, had changed that. He gave the silence a shape. He gave her evenings a purpose. David Park was 38, a landscape architect who worked from home 3 days a week and went into the office the other 2. He had moved into the house after his relationship of 5 years ended badly. Not dramatically. There had been no betrayal, no explosion, just a slow and honest recognition that they had grown into different people who wanted different things. He'd kept the house. She'd kept the plants mostly. He was, as he would tell his friends, fine. He meant it, mostly. But Captain Fluff had a way of showing up at exactly the right moments, during a difficult phone call, during a long and difficult evening, and simply being there, which David had not realized was something he needed until he had it. And between these two houses, behind this shared fence, with his white paws and his extravagant tail, and his expression of complete and serene indifference to the moral complexity of his situation, the cat lived his double life. For nearly 3 years, no one found out. And then, in the most mundane and inevitable way possible, someone did. It started with a vet appointment. Margaret had noticed the previous week that Marmalade seemed a little off. Not dramatically ill. He wasn't hiding, wasn't refusing food, wasn't doing any of the things that send cat owners spiraling into emergency Google searches at midnight. But he seemed heavier than usual. Rounder. She'd picked him up to move him off her keyboard and thought, with mild concern, he feels like he's gained weight. She made a mental note to ask about it at his annual checkup, which was coming up anyway. She loaded him into the carrier, a process that took 15 minutes and left 3 small scratches on her left forearm, and drove to Riverside Animal Clinic, where they had been going since year 1. Dr. Yoon, a calm and thorough woman in her early 40s, examined Marmalade with the practiced efficiency of someone who had seen everything. She weighed him first. At 14.6 pounds, she said, and wrote it down. Margaret frowned. He was 11 pounds last year. Yes, said Dr. Yoon, in a tone that suggested she was organizing her thoughts carefully. He's gained a significant amount of weight since his last visit. Can you tell me about his diet? How much are you feeding him? Margaret explained, half a cup of dry food in the morning, 1 small can of wet food in the evening, the occasional treat. Nothing excessive. She'd been careful. She'd read articles. Dr. Yoon nodded slowly. Then she said, Margaret, I want to ask you something, and I'd like you to think about it carefully. Does Marmalade have access to the outdoors? Yes, he uses a cat flap. He goes out during the day, comes back for dinner. And during those hours outdoors, do you have any idea where he goes? If there's anyone else in the neighborhood who might be feeding him? Margaret stared at her. No. He's my cat. Dr. Yoon's expression was gentle and very slightly amused. I'm not suggesting otherwise. But this weight gain isn't consistent with the diet you've described. Cats that are being fed at multiple locations will sometimes, often actually, eat at each location as though they haven't eaten anywhere else. They're very good at it. There was a pause. Are you saying, Margaret said slowly, that someone else might be feeding my cat? I'm saying it's worth considering. Margaret drove home with Marmalade in the carrier, the cat radiating smug indifference from the back seat, and she sat in her driveway for a moment and thought about it. Who in the neighborhood even interacted with Marmalade? She'd seen him disappear through the garden gate, over the fence, along the side of the house. She'd always assumed he was just exploring, doing cat things, communing with nature. She'd never followed him? She decided that afternoon that she would. Meanwhile, on the other side of the fence, David was having his own revelatory moment. It had actually been building for a while. He'd mentioned Captain to his vet, Dr. Reeves at Millbrook Pet Care, a different clinic across town, at a routine visit 6 months earlier, and Dr. Reeves had noted the weight and said, "He's a healthy boy, maybe slightly on the heavy side. Keep an eye on portions." David had cut back the portions. Captain had continued gaining weight. David had been genuinely baffled. He'd checked the food packaging, recalculated, even wondered if there was something metabolic going on. The second clue had come from his neighbor on the other side, a retired teacher named Frank, who spent a lot of time in his front garden. Frank had flagged David down one morning and said cheerfully, "Your cat sure gets around, doesn't he? I see him cutting through yards all the way down the block." David had said, "Oh yes, he likes to explore." But it had stayed with him, all the way down the block. Captain had a range, and ranges had destinations. The third clue, the one that actually cracked it open, came from something so small, it was almost embarrassing. David had bought a new brand of cat food. He was trying to find something Captain liked better, because Captain had recently begun eating with what David could only describe as reluctance, like a food critic forced to eat somewhere beneath his standards. David bought 3 different brands and put them out on successive days, observing the results scientifically. Captain ate all 3, but with varying enthusiasm. Curious, David left a small camera, one of those little pet cameras people use to check on their animals during the day, on the kitchen counter, angled toward the cat flaps in the food bowl. He watched the footage that evening. Captain came in at 7:15 a.m. ate breakfast, left at 7:45. Captain came in at 12:30 p.m. Ate what was clearly a second full meal with the calm efficiency of a professional, left at 1:10. Captain did not come back until 6:40 p.m., at which point he ate a third meal with only slightly less enthusiasm than the first 2. David sat with this information for a long time. Then he opened his laptop and searched cat eating elsewhere, not at home weight gain. The first result was a Reddit thread titled, "My cat has been living a double life. I found his other family." David read the whole thread. Then he sat back and looked at Captain, who was at that moment grooming himself on the couch with extraordinary serenity. "Captain," David said, "what are you doing?" Captain paused mid-lick, regarded David with amber eyes that contained absolutely no guilt whatsoever, and resumed grooming. The actual discovery happened on a Thursday afternoon in late October. Margaret had been watching Marmalade's movements for 3 days. She'd been subtle about it. She told herself she was just being observant, but really, she'd been trailing him through the garden like a nature documentary filmmaker who had misplaced her camera crew. She watched him slip through the gap in the fence she'd never noticed before, a narrow space between 2 fence boards that had been loosened by the roots of the rosebush. She watched him actually trot, with a purposeful air entirely unlike his usual languid pace, across the neighboring yard. She watched him jump onto the wooden deck. She watched a man she had waved at perhaps 12 times in 3 years come out with a bowl of cat food. She watched her cat eat it with every appearance of sincere gratitude and enjoyment. She stood at the fence, half hidden by the rose bush, and didn't quite know what to do. David, as it happened, looked up. He had been watching Captain Ed and had glanced up at the fence line. He'd developed a habit of looking toward the neighboring yard, vaguely wondering, without knowing exactly what he was wondering about. And he saw Margaret standing there. They looked at each other. Margaret raised her hand in a small, uncertain wave. David looked down at Captain, then back at Margaret, then at Captain again. "Is that—" he started. "Marmalade," Margaret said. "Captain," said David. There was a very long pause. The cat continued eating, unbothered. Neither of them quite knew how to start the conversation. David recovered first. He was, by temperament, a problem solver. The kind of person who, when faced with something unexpected, immediately starts thinking about what to do next rather than lingering in the discomfort of not knowing. He opened the gate in the fence, a gate Margaret hadn't realized existed, and said, "Do you want to come in for a minute? I think we should probably talk." Margaret came through the gate. She felt oddly formal, like she'd been called into a meeting she hadn't prepared for. She stood on David's deck and looked at the cat, her cat, his cat, their cat, who had finished eating and was now sitting beside the empty bowl, licking his paw with complete composure. "How long have you had him?" Margaret asked. 2.5 years, more or less. You? 3 years, I think. She paused. He was a stray when I found him. Thin, a bit scraggly. David frowned. He wasn't thin when he came to us. He'd already filled out. There was a moment where they both processed the implication of this. "So he was already with you," David said slowly, "when he showed up at our place. Apparently. And he just decided to add a second household." "That's my current understanding, yes." They both looked at the cat. The cat looked back at them with an expression of absolute, unruffled dignity. "His name is Marmalade," Margaret offered. "His name is Captain Fluffington," David said. Another pause. "Captain Fluffington," Margaret repeated. "My girlfriend named him. Former girlfriend." He said it without particular weight, just as information. She was going through a pirate phase. Ah, Margaret almost smiled. The absurdity of it was beginning to reach her, not as something upsetting, but as something that was, when you took a step back, genuinely, structurally funny. A cat, running 2 households for years, with 2 names. 2 vets, possibly, she asked, and yes, David confirmed. He had Captain registered at Millbrook, while Marmalade was at Riverside. 2 microchips? They checked the paperwork later and discovered, to their mutual amazement, that the cat had 2 microchips registered to 2 different owners. The vet databases simply hadn't cross-referenced them. No one had looked. "He's been double-chipped," David said, reading from his records. "Like a spy," said Margaret, "like an extremely well-fed spy." It was at this point that they both started laughing. Genuine, slightly helpless laughter, the kind that comes when something has been held as a source of tension or confusion and is suddenly, irrevocably revealed to be hilarious. The cat watched them with the long-suffering patience of someone whose humans were being unnecessarily dramatic about a perfectly sensible arrangement. They ended up sitting at David's bistro table for 2 hours. It had been, and Margaret acknowledged this to herself with some surprise, a very long time since she'd had a conversation like that. Not the kind of conversation she had with her book club, which was warm and enjoyable but followed well-worn tracks. Not the kind she had with her children, which she loved but which carried the particular weight of family. This was something else. 2 strangers who had been made instantly intimate by a shared absurdity, talking freely because there was nothing at stake and nothing to prove. David told her about the pet camera footage, and she laughed so hard she had to put down her tea. She told him about the vet visit, and he said, 14 pounds? With the expression of a man reevaluating everything he thought he knew. They talked about the cat, his habits, his preferences, the things they'd each observed about him, and found themselves building, between them, a much more complete picture of who he actually was. Margaret knew he hated rain and would sit at the window staring at it with contempt. David knew he had a specific chirping vocalization he used only when watching birds. Margaret knew he liked to be scratched behind his left ear more than his right, and that he would bite you, gently but firmly, if you switched without permission. David knew that he could open lever-style door handles if he was sufficiently motivated, and that he had a habit of appearing silently behind you in a dark hallway in a way that had caused David to drop a full mug of coffee on 2 separate occasions. "So what do we do?" David asked eventually. It was the practical question, and it hung in the air between them. What did you do when you discovered that your cat had been living a double life? The obvious answer, the one that a certain kind of person would leap to immediately, was to decide ownership, establish boundaries, close the cat flap, confine him to one home, resolve the situation cleanly. Neither of them said that. Margaret looked at the cat, who had relocated during their conversation to a patch of sun near the edge of the deck, and was sleeping in that liquid, total way that cats sleep, his paws tucked under his chest, his breathing slow and even, and entirely untroubled. "He seems to like both houses," she said. "He does seem to like both houses," David agreed. "He's been doing this for years without any obvious ill effects, except the weight, obviously. We'd need to coordinate on the food, dramatically reduce portions at each location. He won't like that." "No," David agreed. "He absolutely will not." They both looked at the cat. "He chose this," Margaret said after a moment. Not defensively, more with a kind of wondering acceptance. "I mean, he had options. He could have just been my cat. He could have just been yours. And he decided, at some point on some afternoon, that he wanted both." David nodded slowly. "And he made it work, for years. He's very competent. Disturbingly so." There was another pause, and then David said, "I think I need to make you a cup of tea. A proper one, because I have a feeling this conversation isn't over, and we might as well be comfortable." Margaret said that sounded reasonable. The cat slept on. Over the following 2 weeks, Margaret and David did something that, in retrospect, seemed almost inevitable, though it had required a cat of unusual ambition to make it happen. They became friends. Not the vague, nodding, good-weather conversation kind of neighbors they'd been before. Actual friends. The kind who text each other. The kind who know each other's coffee order. It started with the logistics. They genuinely did need to coordinate on the feeding schedule and coordinate on vet records and have one honest conversation about whether the current arrangement should continue, or whether one of them should assume formal sole ownership of a creature who had, functionally, already solved this question on his own terms. They agreed fairly quickly on the following. One official owner of record, Margaret, since she had the earlier claim, with David listed as an emergency contact and co-caretaker. The cat's legal name on the microchip would be updated to Marmalade, but David reserved the right to continue calling him Captain in private. The 2 microchip registrations were consolidated. They switched to coordinated feeding, with Margaret handling breakfast and dinner and David providing a small midday snack, much smaller than the full meal the cat had been helping himself to, on the days he was working from home. The cat was furious about the reduced portions for approximately 4 days, during which he staged what David described as a passive-aggressive hunger strike, sitting pointedly next to his empty bowl and staring at Margaret or David with an expression of theatrical betrayal, and then adjusted, because cats, ultimately, are pragmatic. His weight started coming down within 6 weeks. Dr. Yoon was pleased. Dr. Reeves, when David called to update the records and explain the situation, laughed for what felt like a very long time and said it was the best story he'd heard all year. But the logistical resolution was really just the frame. the more important thing, the thing that neither Margaret nor David would have predicted and that took them both a while to fully articulate, even to themselves, was what it meant to have found each other. Margaret's daughter called in November, a few weeks after the discovery, and Margaret found herself telling the whole story: the vet visit, the surveillance, the moment at the fence, the 2-hour conversation on the deck. And her daughter listened and then said, with the gentle perception of someone who knows their parent well, "Mom, you sound really happy." Margaret paused and thought about it. "I think I might be," she said. "A little more than I was." She'd had the same house, the same routines, the same quiet evenings for 7 years. What had changed was not any of that. What had changed was the fence. The gap in the fence that the cat used had always been there. She simply hadn't known it. And now there was a gate, and the gate opened both ways, and there was someone on the other side who had turned out to be unexpectedly worth knowing. David, for his part, was less good at articulating these things. He experienced them more than examined them. But he noticed the change, too. He noticed that he looked forward to the texts. He noticed that he had started, without quite deciding to, keeping better tea in the house in case Margaret came by. He noticed that the evenings he spent on the deck, the ones where he'd be reading and Captain would be nearby and the neighborhood was quiet, had a different quality now. Not because anything visible had changed, but because the house on the other side of the fence was no longer just a house. It was a place where someone he knew lived. They started taking the cat to the vet together. It was more efficient, coordinating schedules, one car, but it was also, they both knew, simply a reason. Dr. Yoon, who had been the unwitting catalyst for all of this, observed their easy conversation in the waiting room and said, on the third visit, "You two seem like you've known each other for a long time." "About 4 months," David said. "And a shared cat for about 3 years," Margaret added. Dr. Yoon absorbed this. "The cat arranged it," she concluded. "Essentially," Margaret agreed. "He's been trying to tell you something this whole time. You just finally had the conversation." This was, they both felt, a somewhat generous reading of the cat's motivations. The cat's motivations were probably more straightforwardly selfish: more food, more warm laps, more territory. But the result was the same. In trying to maximize his own comfort, he had, accidentally and somewhat magnificently, maximized theirs. The story spread through the neighborhood with the particular velocity that good stories have. The ones that are just improbable enough to be wonderful, just ordinary enough to feel true. Frank, the retired teacher, told his wife, who told the couple across the street, who mentioned it at a neighborhood watch meeting, which is when it really took on momentum. By Christmas, it had traveled several blocks in multiple directions. By January, Margaret had been contacted by someone who ran a local community newsletter and wanted to write it up. The newsletter piece was titled, "The Cat Who United Two Neighbors." This was slightly overdramatic. They would have said they'd been connected rather than united, since they weren't a package deal in any formal sense, and the cat remained, legally, a single entity. But they appreciated the spirit of it. What Margaret told the newsletter writer was this: "I spent 3 years thinking I understood exactly what my life looked like. My cat helped me see there was a whole part of it I'd been missing right next door." What David told the newsletter writer was, "I think the lesson is that you should probably watch where your cat goes. But also, sometimes not knowing is how you end up with something unexpected." The newsletter writer, who had a background in feature journalism, suggested that the cat had displayed an almost uncanny emotional intelligence in choosing two homes that balanced each other so perfectly. The cat, when informed of this interpretation by David reading the article aloud to him one evening, expressed no opinion. He was on the couch, the left armrest spot, the warm one. He was asleep. Marmalade, Captain Fluffington, is 11 pounds now. Healthy, glossy, professionally indignant about the portion situation, but otherwise thriving. He still uses the gap in the fence, though it has been slightly widened for his comfort. He still visits both houses every day. He still has 2 names, 2 beds, 2 people who love him in different ways and for different reasons. He is, his vet has noted, an unusually contented cat. David and Margaret are, by this point, something that is hard to categorize neatly. They're neighbors, friends, co-parents of a morally flexible tabby, regular companions for walks and dinners and the occasional movie. They're in each other's lives in the particular way that matters, consistently, without drama, because they want to be. Margaret's children have met David. They like him. Her son, on his last visit, watched David arrive at the back door with a bag of groceries he'd picked up without being asked, because he'd been going anyway, and Margaret had mentioned she was out of a few things and said, quietly to his mother, "He's good, Mom." Margaret said, "Yes, he is." She did not mention that she had a fluffy orange cat to thank for it. The cat, for his part, has shown no interest in expanding his operation further. 2 households are, apparently, sufficient. He has found his equilibrium. He is optimized. He is, when you really think about it, the most successful relationship counselor in the neighborhood. Unlicensed, ethically questionable, extraordinarily well-fed. And he knows it. Thanks for watching. If you've ever had a cat with a secret life, or if you are the secret second family, drop it in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, you know what to do.